The Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Book 1. Sailing to the Future, in which the Prince of Ruins embarks upon a mysterious ship. It was as if the man stood in a vast cavern, whose walls and roof were composed of gloomy, unstable colors, which would occasionally break and admit rays of light from the moon. That these walls were mere clouds massed above the mountains and oceans was hard to believe, for all that the moonlight pierced them, stained them, and revealed the black and turbulent sea washing the shore on which the man now stood. Distant thunder rolled, distant lightning flickered, a thin rain fell, and the clouds were never still. From dusky jet to deadly white they swirled slowly, like the cloaks of men and women engaged in a trance-like and formalistic minuet. The man standing on the shingle of the grim beach was reminded of giants dancing to the music of the faraway storm, and felt as one must feel who walks unwittingly into a hall where the gods are at play. He turned his gaze from the clouds to the ocean. The sea seemed weary. Great waves heaved themselves together with difficulty and collapsed as if in relief, gasping as they struck sharp rocks. The man pulled his hood closer about his face and looked over his leathern shoulder more than once as he trudged closer to the sea and let the surf spill upon the toes of his knee-length black boots. He tried to peer into the cavern formed by the clouds, but could only see a short distance. There was no way of telling what lay on the other side of the ocean, or, indeed, how far the water extended. He put his head on one side, listening carefully, but could hear nothing but the sounds of the sky and the sea. He sighed. For a moment a moonbeam touched him, and from the white flesh of his face there glowed two crimson, tormented eyes. Then darkness came back. Again the man turned, plainly fearing that the light had revealed him to some enemy. Making as little sound as possible, he headed towards the shelter of the rocks on his left. Elric was tired. In the city of Ryfel, in the land of Picarade, he had naively sought acceptance by offering his services as a mercenary in the army of the governor of that place. For his foolishness he had been imprisoned as a Melnibonéan spy. It was obvious to the governor that Elric could be nothing else, and had but recently escaped with the aid of bribes and some minor sorcery. The pursuit, however, had been almost immediate. Dogs of great cunning had been employed, and the governor himself had led the hunt beyond the borders of Picarade into the lonely, uninhabited shale valleys of a world locally called the Dead Hills, in which little grew or tried to live. Up the steep sides of small mountains whose slopes consisted of gray, crumbling slate, which made a clatter to be heard a mile or more away, the white-faced one had ridden. Along dales all but grassless, and whose river bottoms had seen no water for scores of years, through cave tunnels bare of even a stalactite, over plateaus from which rose cairns of stones erected by a forgotten folk, he had sought to escape his pursuers, and soon it seemed to him that he had left the world he knew forever, that he had crossed a supernatural frontier and arrived in one of those bleak places of which he had read in the legends of his people, where once law and chaos had fought each other to a stalemate, leaving their battleground empty of life and the possibility of life. And at last he had ridden his horse so hard that its heart had burst, and he had abandoned its corpse and continued on foot, panting to the sea, to this narrow beach, unable to go farther forward, and fearing to return lest his enemies should be lying in wait for him. He would give much for a boat now. It would not be long before the dogs discovered his scent and led their masters to the beach. He shrugged. Best to die here alone, perhaps, slaughtered by those who did not even know his name. His only regret would be that Cymril would wonder why he had not returned at the end of the year. He had little food, and few of the drugs which had of late sustained his energy. Without renewed energy, he could not contemplate working a sorcery, which might conjure for him some means of crossing the sea and making, perhaps, for the Isle of the Purple Towns, where the people were least unfriendly to Melnibonéans. It had been months since he had left behind his court and his queen-to-be, letting Erekosë sit on the throne of Melniboné until his return. He had thought he might learn more of the human folk of the young kingdoms by mixing with them, but they had rejected him, either with outright hatred or wary and insincere humility. Nowhere had he found one willing to believe that a Melnibonéan, and they did not know he was the emperor, would willingly throw in his lot with the human beings who had once been enthralled to that cruel and ancient race. And now, as he stood beside a bleak sea feeling trapped and already defeated, he knew himself to be alone in a malevolent universe, bereft of friends and purpose, a useless, sickly anachronism, a fool brought low by his own insufficiencies of character, by his profound inability to believe wholly in the rightness or the wrongness of anything at all. He lacked faith in his race, in his birthright, in gods or men, and above all, he lacked faith in himself. His pace slackened. His hand fell upon the pommel of his black rune sword. Stormbringer, seemingly half-sentient, was now his only companion, his only confidant, and it had become his neurotic habit to talk to the sword as another might talk to his horse, or as a prisoner might share his thoughts with a cockroach in his cell. "Well, Stormbringer, shall we walk into the sea and end it now? At least we shall have the pleasure of thwarting those who follow us." He made a half-hearted movement toward the sea, but to his fatigued brain it seemed that the sword murmured, stirred against his hip, pulled back. The albino chuckled. "You exist to live and to take lives. Do I exist then to die and bring both those I love and hate the mercy of death? Sometimes I think so. A sad pattern, if that should be the pattern. Yet there must be more to all this." He turned his back upon the sea, peering upward at the monstrous clouds forming and reforming above his head, letting the light rain fall upon his face, listening to the complex, melancholy music which the sea made as it washed over rocks and shingle, and was carried this way and that by conflicting currents. The rain did little to refresh him. He had not slept at all for 2 nights, and had slept hardly at all for several more. He must have ridden almost for a week before his horse collapsed. At the base of a damp granite crag which rose nearly 30 feet above his head, he found a depression in the ground in which he could squat and be protected from the worst of the wind and the rain. Wrapping his heavy leather cloak tightly about him, he eased himself into the hole and was immediately asleep. Let them find him while he slept. He wanted no warning of his death. Harsh gray light struck his eyes as he stirred. He raised his neck, holding back a groan at the stiffness of his muscles, and he opened his eyes. He blinked. It was morning, perhaps even later, for the sun was invisible, and a cold mist covered the beach. Through the mist, the darker clouds could still be seen above, increasing the effect of his being inside a huge cavern. Muffled a little, the sea continued to splash and hiss, though it seemed calmer than it had on the previous night, and there were now no sounds of a storm. The air was very cold. Elric began to stand up, leaning on his sword for support, listening carefully, but there was no sign that his enemies were close by. Doubtless they had given up the chase, perhaps after finding his dead horse. He reached into his belt pouch and took from it a sliver of smoked bacon and a vial of yellowish liquid. He sipped from the vial, replaced the stopper, and returned the vial to his pouch as he chewed on the meat. He was thirsty. He trudged further up the beach and found a pool of rainwater not too tainted with salt. He drank his fill, staring around him. The mist was fairly thick, and if he moved too far from the beach, he knew he would become immediately lost. Yet did that matter? He had nowhere to go. Those who had pursued him must have realized that. Without a horse, he could not cross back to Erekosë. the most easterly of the young kingdoms. Without a boat, he could not venture onto that sea and try to steer a course back to the Isle of the Purple Towns. He recalled no map which showed an eastern sea, and he had little idea of how far he had traveled from Pikare. He decided that his only hope of surviving was to go north, following the coast in the trust that sooner or later he would come upon a port or a fishing village where he might trade his few remaining belongings for a passage on a boat. Yet that hope was a small one, for his food and his drugs could hardly last more than a day or so. He took a deep breath to steel himself for the march, and then regretted it. The mist cut at his throat and his lungs like 1,000 tiny knives. He coughed. He spat upon the shingle. And he heard something. Something other than the moody whisperings of the sea. A regular creaking sound, as of a man walking in stiff leather. His right hand went to his left hip and the sword which rested there. He turned about, peering in every direction for the source of the noise, but the mist distorted it. It could have come from anywhere. Elric crept back to the rock where he had sheltered. He leaned against it, so that no swordsman could take him unawares from behind. He waited. The creaking came again, but other sounds were added. He heard a clanking, a splash, perhaps a voice, perhaps a footfall on timber, and he guessed that either he was experiencing a hallucination as a side effect of the drug he had just swallowed, or he had heard a ship coming towards the beach and dropping its anchor. He felt relieved, and he was tempted to laugh at himself for assuming so readily that this coast must be uninhabited. He had thought that the bleak cliffs stretched for miles, perhaps hundreds of miles in all directions. The assumption could easily have been the subjective result of his depression, his weariness. It occurred to him that he might as easily have discovered a land not shown on maps, yet with a sophisticated culture of its own, with sailing ships, for instance, and harbors for them. Yet still, he did not reveal himself. Instead, he withdrew behind the rock, peering into the mist towards the sea, and at last he discerned a shadow which had not been there the previous night, a black, angular shadow which could only be a ship. He made out the suggestion of ropes. He heard men grunting. He heard the creak and rasp of a yard as it traveled up a mast. The sail was being furled. Elric waited at least an hour, expecting the crew of the ship to disembark. They could have no other reason for entering this treacherous bay. But a silence had descended, as if the whole ship slept. Cautiously, Elric emerged from behind the rock and walked down to the edge of the sea. Now he could see the ship a little more clearly. Red sunlight was behind it, thin and watery, diffused by the mist. It was a good-sized ship, and fashioned throughout of the same dark wood. Its design was baroque and unfamiliar, with high decks fore and aft, and no evidence of rowing ports. This was unusual in a ship either of Melniboné or Young Kingdom's design, and it tended to prove his theory that he had stumbled upon a civilization for some reason cut off from the rest of the world, just as Elwar and the unmapped East were cut off by the vast stretches of the sighing desert and the weeping waste. He saw no movement aboard, heard none of the sounds one might usually expect to hear on a sea-going ship, even if the larger part of the crew was resting. The mist eddied, and more of the red light poured through to illuminate the vessel, revealing the large wheels on both the foredeck and the rear deck, the slender mast with its furled sail, the complicated geometrical carving of its rails and its figurehead, the great curving prow which gave the ship its main impression of power and strength, and made Elric think it must be a warship rather than a trading vessel. But who was there to fight in such waters as these? He cast aside his wariness and cupped his hands about his mouth, calling out, "Hail the ship!" The answering silence seemed to him to take on a peculiar hesitancy, as if those on board heard him and wondered if they should answer. "Hail the ship!" Then a figure appeared on the port rail and, leaning over, looked casually toward him. The figure had on armor as dark and as strange as the design of his ship. He had a helmet obscuring most of his face, and the main feature that Elric could distinguish was a thick, golden beard and sharp blue eyes.
"Hail the shore,"
said the armored man. His accent was unknown to Elric. His tone was as casual as his manner. Elric thought he smiled.
"What do you seek with us?"
"Aid. I am stranded here. My horse is dead. I am lost."
"Lost? Lost, and you wish to come aboard?"
"I can pay a little. I can give my services in return for a passage, either to your next port of call or to some land close to the young kingdoms, where maps are available, so I could make my own way thereafter."
"Well, there's work for a swordsman."
"I have a sword."
"I see it. A good big battle blade."
"Then I can come aboard."
"We must confer first. If you would be good enough to wait a while."
"Of course." Elric was nonplussed by the man's manner, but the prospect of warmth and food on board the ship was cheering. He waited patiently until the blonde-bearded warrior came back to the rail.
"Your name, sir?"
"I am Elric of Melniboné." The warrior seemed to be consulting a parchment, running his finger down a list until he nodded, satisfied, and put the list into his large buckled belt.
"Well, there was some point in waiting here after all. I found it difficult to believe."
"What was the dispute, and why did you wait?"
"For you,"
said the warrior, heaving a rope ladder over the side so that its end fell into the sea.
"Will you board now, Elric of Melniboné?"
Chapter 2. The Blind Captain. Elric was surprised by how shallow the water was, and he wondered by what means such a large vessel could come so close to the shore. Shoulder deep in the sea, he reached up to grasp the ebony rungs of the ladder. He had great difficulty heaving himself from the water, and was further hampered by the swaying of the ship and the weight of his rune sword, but eventually he had clambered awkwardly over the side and stood on the deck, with the water running from his clothes to the timbers and his body shivering with cold. He looked about him. Shining, red-tinted mist clung to the ship's dark yards and rigging. White mist spread itself over the roofs and sides of the two large cabins set fore and aft of the mast. And this mist was not of the same character as the mist beyond the ship. Elric for a moment had the fanciful notion that the mist traveled permanently wherever the ship traveled. He smiled to himself, putting the dreamlike quality of his experience down to the lack of food and sleep. When the ship sailed into sunnier waters, he would see it for the relatively ordinary vessel it was. The blond warrior took Elric's arm. The man was as tall as Elric and massively built. Within his helm he smiled, saying,
"Let us go below."
They went to the cabin forward of the mast, and the warrior drew back a sliding door, standing aside to let Elric enter first. Elric ducked his head and went into the warmth of the cabin. A lamp of red-gray glass gleamed, hanging from 4 silver chains attached to the roof, revealing several more bulky figures fully dressed in a variety of armors, seated about a square and sturdy sea table. All faces turned to regard Elric as he came in, followed by the blond warrior, who said,
"This is he."
One of the occupants of the cabin, who sat in the farthest corner and whose features were completely hidden by the shadow, nodded.
"Aye, that is he."
"You know me, sir?" said Elric, seating himself at the end of the bench and removing his sodden leather cloak. The warrior nearest him passed him a metal cup of hot wine, and Elric accepted it gratefully, sipping at the spiced liquid and marveling at how quickly it dispersed the chill within him.
"In a sense,"
said the man in the shadows. His voice was sardonic and at the same time had a melancholy ring, and Elric was not offended, for the bitterness in the voice seemed directed more at the owner than at any he addressed. The blond warrior seated himself opposite Elric.
"I am Brute, once of Lashmar, where my family still holds land, but it is many a year since I have been there."
"From the young kingdoms, then?"
"Aye, once."
This ship journeys nowhere near those nations?
I believe it does not. It is not so long, I think, since I myself came aboard. I was seeking Tanalorn, but found this craft instead.
Tanalorn? How many must seek that mythical place? Do you know of one called Rakir, once a warrior priest of Fum? We adventured together once. He left to look for Tanalorn.
I do not know him, said Brute of Lashmar.
And these waters, do they lie far from the young kingdoms?
Very far, said the man in the shadows.
Are you from Elware, perhaps? Asked Elric, or from any other of what we in the West call the unmapped East?
Most of our lands are not on your maps, said the man in the shadows,
and he laughed. Again, Elric found that he was not offended, and he was not particularly troubled by the mysteries hinted at by the man in the shadows. Soldiers of fortune, as he deemed these men to be, were fond of their private jokes and references. It was usually all that united them, save a common willingness to hire their swords to whomever could pay. Outside, the anchor was rattling and the ship rolled. Elric heard the yard being lowered, and he heard the smack of the sail as it was unfurled. He wondered how they hoped to leave the bay with so little wind available. He noticed that the faces of the other warriors, where their faces were visible, had taken on a rather set look as the ship began to move. He looked from one grim, haunted face to another, and he wondered if his own features bore the same cast. "For where do we sail?" he asked.
Brute shrugged. "I only know we had to stop to wait for you, Elric of Melniboné."
"You knew I would be there?" The man in the shadows stirred and helped himself to more hot wine from the jug set into a hole in the center of the table.
"You're the last one we need. I was the first taken aboard. So far, I have not regretted my decision to make the voyage."
"Your name, sir." Elric decided he would no longer be at that particular disadvantage.
"Oh, names. Names, I have so many. The one I favor is Erekosë. But I have been called Ulrich Skarsol and John Dacre, and Ilian of Garethorn. To my certain knowledge, some would have me believe that I have been Elric Womanslayer."
"Womanslayer? An unpleasant nickname. Who is this other Elric?"
"That I cannot completely answer, but I share a name, it seems, with more than one aboard this ship. I, like Brute, sought Tanalorn, and found myself here instead."
"We have that in common," said another. He was a black-skinned warrior, the tallest of the company, his features oddly enhanced by a scar running like an inverted V from his forehead and over both eyes, down his cheeks to his jawbones.
"I was in a land called Gajaki, a most unpleasant, swampy place filled with perverse and diseased life. I had heard of a city said to exist there, and I thought it might be Tanalorn. It was not. And it was inhabited by a blue-skinned, hermaphroditic race, who determined to cure me of what they considered my malformations of hue and sexuality. This scar, you see, was their work. The pain of their operation gave me strength to escape them, and I ran naked into the swamps, floundering for many a mile until the swamp became a lake, feeding a broad river, over which hung black clouds of insects which set upon me hungrily. This ship appeared, and I was more than glad to seek its sanctuary. I am Otto Blendker, once a scholar of Brunes, now a hireling sword for my sins."
"This Brunes, does it lie near Elware?" said Elric. He had never heard of such a place, nor of such an outlandish name in the young kingdoms. The black man shook his head.
"I know naught of Elware."
"Then the world is a considerably larger place than I imagined."
"Indeed it is," said Erekosë. "What would you say if I offered you the theory that the sea on which we sail spans more than one world?"
"I would be inclined to believe you," Elric smiled. "I have studied such theories. More, I have experienced adventures in worlds other than my own."
"It is a relief to hear it. Not all on board this ship are willing to accept my theory." I come closer to accepting it, said Otto Blenker, though I find it terrifying.
It is that, agreed Erekosë.
More terrifying than you can imagine, friend Otto.
Elric leaned across the table and helped himself to a further mug of wine. His clothes were already drying, and physically he had a sense of well-being. I'll be glad to leave this misty shore behind.
The shore's been left already, said Brute. But for the mist, it is ever with us. Mist appears to follow the ship, or else the ship creates the mist wherever it travels. It is rare that we see land at all, and when we do see it, as we saw it today, it is usually obscured like a reflection in a dull and buckled shield.
We sail on a supernatural sea, said another, holding out a gloved hand for the jug.
Elric passed it to him.
In Hasgan, where I come from, we have a legend of a bewitched sea. If a mariner finds himself sailing in those waters, he may never return, and will be lost for eternity.
Your legend contains at least some truth, I fear, Elric of Hasgan, Brute said.
How many warriors are on board? Elric asked.
16, other than the 4, said Erekosë. 20 in all. The crew number's about 10, and then there is the captain. You will see him soon, doubtless.
The 4? Who are they? Erekosë laughed.
You and I are 2 of them. The other 2 occupy the aft cabin. And if you wish to know why we are called the 4, you must ask the captain, although I warn you, his answers are rarely satisfying.
Elric realized he was being pressed slightly to one side. The ship makes good speed, considering how poor the wind was.
Excellent speed, agreed Erekosë. He rose from his corner, a broad-shouldered man with an ageless face bearing the evidence of considerable experience.
He was handsome, and he had plainly seen much conflict, for both his hands and his face were heavily scarred, though not disfigured. His eyes, though deep-set and dark, seemed of no particular color, and yet were familiar to Elric. He felt that he might have seen those eyes in a dream once. Have we met before?
Oh, possibly. Or shall meet. What does it matter? Our fates are the same. We share an identical doom. And possibly we share more than that.
More? I hardly comprehend the first part of your statement.
Then it is for the best, said
Erekosë, inching past his comrades and emerging on the other side of the table. He laid a surprisingly gentle hand on Elric's shoulder.
Come, we must seek an audience with the captain. He expressed a wish to see you shortly after you came aboard.
Elric nodded and rose. This captain? What is his name?
He has none he will reveal to us, said
Erekosë. Together they emerged onto the deck. The mist was, if anything, thicker and of the same deathly whiteness, no longer tinted by the sun's rays. It was hard to see to the far ends of the ship, and for all that they were evidently moving rapidly, there was no hint of a wind. Yet it was warmer than Elric might have expected. He followed Erekosë forward to the cabin, set under the deck on which one of the ship's twin wheels stood, tended by a tall man in seacoat and leggings of quilted deerskin, who was so still as to resemble a statue. The red-haired steersman did not look around or down as they advanced toward the cabin, but Elric caught a glimpse of his face. The door seemed built of some kind of smooth metal possessing a sheen almost like the healthy coat of an animal. It was reddish-brown, and the most colorful thing Elric had seen so far on the ship. Erekosë knocked softly upon the door.
Captain, Elric is here.
Enter. The door opened. Rosy light flooded out, half blinding Elric as he walked in. As his eyes adapted, he could see a very tall, pale-clad man standing upon a richly hued carpet in the middle of the cabin. Elric heard the door close and realized that Erekosë had not accompanied him inside.
"Are you refreshed, Elric?" said the captain.
"I am, sir, thanks to your wine." The captain's features were no more human than were Elric's.
They were at once finer and more powerful than those of the Melnibonéan, yet bore a slight resemblance in that the eyes were inclined to taper, as did the face, toward the chin. The captain's long hair fell to his shoulders in red-gold waves and was kept back from his brow by a circlet of blue jade. His body was clad in buff-colored tunic and hose, and there were sandals of silver and silver thread laced to his calves. Apart from his clothing, he was twin to the steersman Elric had recently seen. "Will you have more wine?" The captain moved towards a chest on the far side of the cabin, near the porthole, which was closed. "Thank you." And now Elric realized why the eyes had not focused on him. The captain was blind. For all that his movements were deft and assured, it was obvious he could not see at all. He poured the wine from a silver jug into a silver cup and began to cross towards Elric, holding the cup out before him. Elric stepped forward and accepted it. "I am grateful for your decision to join us. I am much relieved, sir." "You are courteous. Though I must add that my decision was not difficult to make. I had nowhere else to go." "I understand that. It is why we put into shore when and where we did. You will find that all your companions were in a similar position before they, too, came aboard." "You appear to have considerable knowledge of the movements of many men." Elric held the wine untasted in his left hand. "Many, on many worlds. I understand you are a person of culture, sir, so you will be aware of something of the nature of the sea upon which my ship sails?" "I think so." "She sails between the worlds, for the most part, between the planes of a variety of aspects of the same world, to be a little more exact." The captain hesitated, turning his blind face away from Elric. "Please know that I do not deliberately mystify you. There are some things I do not understand, and other things which I may not completely reveal. It is a trust I have, and I hope you feel you can respect it." "I have no reason as yet to do otherwise." And Elric took a sip of the wine. "I find myself with a fine company. I hope that you continue to think it worthwhile honoring my trust when we reach our destination." "And what is that, Captain?" "An island indigenous to these waters." "That must be a rarity." "Indeed it is. And once undiscovered, uninhabited by those we must count our enemies, now that they have found it and realize its power, we are in great danger." "We? You mean your race and those aboard your ship?" The captain smiled. "I have no race save myself. I speak, I suppose, of all humanity." "These enemies are not human, then?" "No. They are inextricably involved in human affairs, but this fact has not instilled in them any loyalty to us. I use humanity, of course, in its broader sense, to include yourself and myself." "I understood. What is this folk called?" "Many things. Forgive me, but I cannot continue longer now. If you will ready yourself for battle, I assure you, I will reveal more to you as soon as the time is right." Only when Elric stood again outside the reddish-brown door, watching Erekosë advancing up the deck through the mist, did the albino wonder if the captain had charmed him to the point where he'd forgotten all common sense. Yet the blind man had impressed him, and he had, after all, nothing better to do than to sail on to the island. He shrugged. He could always alter his decision if he discovered that those upon the island were not, in his opinion, enemies. "Are you more mystified or less, Elric?" said Erekosë, smiling. "More mystified in some ways, and less in others. And for some reason, I do not care." "Then you share the feeling of the whole company." It was only when Erekosë led him to the cabin after the mast that Elric realized he had not asked the captain what the significance of the four might be. Chapter 3. Some reference to the three who are one. Save that it faced in the opposite direction, the other cabin resembled the first in almost every detail. Here, too, were seated some dozen men, all experienced soldiers of fortune by their features and their clothing. Two sat together at a center of the table's starboard side. One was bareheaded, fair and careworn. The other had features resembling Elric's own, and he seemed to be wearing a silver gauntlet on his left hand, while the right hand was naked. His armor was delicate and outlandish. He looked up as Elric entered, and there was recognition in his single eye. The other was covered by a brocade-work patch.
Elric of Melniboné, my theories become more meaningful.
He turned to his companion. See, Hawkmoon, this is the one of whom I spoke.
You know me, sir? Elric was nonplussed.
You recognize me, Elric, you must. At the Tower of Voilodian Gagnastiak, with Erekosë, though a different Erekosë. I am Corum.
I know of no such tower, no name which resembles that, and this is the first I've seen of Erekosë. You know me, and you know my name, but I do not know you. I find this disconcerting, sir.
I, too, had never met Prince Corum before he came aboard, said Erekosë. Yet he insists we fought together once. I am inclined to believe him. Time on the different planes does not always run concurrently. Prince Corum might well exist in what we would term the future.
I had thought to find some relief from such paradoxes here, said Hawkmoon, passing his hand over his face. He smiled bleakly. But it seems there is none at this present moment in the history of the plains. Everything is in flux, and even our identities, it seems, are prone to alter at any moment.
We were three, said Corum. Do you not recall it, Elric? The three who are one?
Elric shook his head. Corum shrugged, saying softly to himself, Well, now we are four. Did the captain say anything of an island we're supposed to invade? He did. Do you know who these enemies might be? We know no more or less than you do, Elric, said Hawkmoon. I seek a place called Tanalorn, and 2 children. Perhaps I seek the rune staff, too. Of that I am not entirely sure.
We found it once, said Corum. We 3. In the Tower of Voilodian Gagnastiak. It was of considerable help to us.
As it might be to me, Hawkmoon told him. I served it once. I gave it a great deal.
We have much in common, Erekosë put in. As I told you, Elric, perhaps we share masters in common, too?
Elric shrugged. I serve no master, but myself. And he wondered why they all smiled in the same strange way. Erekosë said quietly, On such ventures as these, one is inclined to forget much, as one forgets a dream. This is a dream, said Hawkmoon. Of late, I've dreamed many such.
It is all dreaming, if you like, said Corum. All existence.
Elric was not interested in such philosophizing. Dream or reality, the experience amounts to the same, does it not?
Quite right,
said Erekosë with a wan smile. They talked on for another hour or two until Corum stretched and yawned and commented he was feeling sleepy. The others agreed that they were all tired, and so they left the cabin and went aft and below, where there were bunks for all the warriors. As he stretched himself out in one of the bunks, Elric said to Brute of Lashmar, who had climbed into the bunk above, It would help to know when this fight begins. Brute looked over the edge down at the prone albino. I think it will be soon. Elric stood alone upon the deck, leaning upon the rail and trying to make out the sea, but the sea, like the rest of the world, was hidden by white curling mist. Elric wondered if there were waters flowing under the ship's keel at all.
He looked up to where the sail was tight and swollen at the mast, filled with warm and powerful wind. It was light, but again it was not possible to tell the hour of the day. Puzzled by Corum's comments concerning an earlier meeting, Elric wondered if there had been other dreams in his life such as this might be, dreams he'd forgotten completely upon awakening. But the uselessness of such speculation became quickly evident, and he turned his attention to more immediate matters, wondering at the origin of the captain and his strange ship sailing on a stranger ocean. "The captain," said Hawkmoon, and Elric turned to bid good morning to the tall, fair-haired man who bore a strange, regular scar in the center of his forehead, "has requested that we four visit him in his cabin." The other two emerged from the mist, and together they made their way to the prow, knocking on the reddish-brown door and being at once admitted into the presence of the blind captain, who had 4 silver wine cups already poured for them. He gestured them towards the great chest on which the wine stood. "Please help yourselves, my friends." They did so, standing there with the cups in their hands, 4 tall, doom-haunted swordsmen, each of a strikingly different cast of features, yet each bearing a certain stamp which marked them as being of a like kind. Elric noticed it, for all that he was one of them, and he tried to recall the details of what Corum had told him on the previous evening. "We are nearing our destination. It will not be long before we disembark. I do not believe our enemies expect us, yet it will be a hard fight against those 2. "2?" said Hawkmoon. "Only 2? "Only 2, the captain smiled. "A brother and a sister, sorcerers from quite another universe than ours. Due to recent disruptions in the fabric of our worlds, of which you know something, Hawkmoon, and you too, Corum, certain beings have been released who would not otherwise have the power they now possess, and possessing great power, they crave for more, for all the power that there is in our universe. These beings are amoral in a way in which the lords of law or chaos are not. They do not fight for influence upon the earth as the gods do. Their only wish is to convert the essential energy of our universe to their own uses. I believe they foster some ambition in their particular universe, which would be furthered if they could achieve their wish. At present, in spite of conditions highly favorable to them, they have not attained their full strength, but the time is not far off before they do attain it. Agak and Gagak is how they are called in human tongue, and they are outside the power of any of our gods, so a more powerful group has been summoned. Yourselves. The champion eternal in 4 of his incarnations, and 4 is the maximum number we can risk without precipitating further unwelcome disruptions among the planes of Earth. Erekosë, Elric, Corum, and Hawkmoon. Each of you will command 4 others whose fates are linked with your own, and who are great fighters in their own right, though they do not share your destinies in every sense. You may each pick the 4 with whom you wish to fight. I think you will find it easy enough to decide. We make landfall quite shortly now." "You will lead us?" said Hawkmoon. "I cannot. I can only take you to the island and wait for those who survive, if any survive." Elric frowned. "This fight is not mine, I think." "It is yours," said the captain, "and it is mine. I would land with you if that were permitted me, but it is not." "Why so?" said Corum. "You will learn that one day. I have not the courage to tell you. I bear you nothing but goodwill, however. Be assured of that." Erekosë rubbed his jaw. "Well, since it is my destiny to fight, and since I, like Hawkmoon, continue to seek Tanalorn, and since I gather there's some chance of my fulfilling my ambition if I'm successful, I, for one, agree to go against these 2, Agak and Gagak." Hawkmoon nodded. "I go with Erekosë, for similar reasons." "And I," said Corum. "Not long since," said Elric, "I counted myself without comrades. Now I have many. For that reason alone, I will fight with them." "It is perhaps the best of reasons," said Erekosë approvingly. "There is no reward for this work save my assurance that your success will save the world much misery," said the captain. "And for you, Elric, there is less reward than the rest may hope for." "Perhaps not," said Elric. "As you say." The captain gestured toward the jug of wine. "More wine, my friends?" They each accepted, while the captain continued, his blind face staring upward at the roof of the cabin. "Upon this island is a ruin. Perhaps it was once a city called Tanalorn, and in the center of the ruin stands one whole building. It is this building which Agak and his sister use. It is that which you must attack. You will recognize it, I hope, at once." "And must we slay this pair?" said Erekosë. "If you can. They have servants who help them. These must be slain also. Then the building must be fired. This is important." The captain paused. "Fired. It must be destroyed in no other way." Elric smiled a dry smile. "There are few other ways of destroying buildings, Sir Captain." The captain returned his smile and made a slight bow of acknowledgement. "Aye, it is so. Nonetheless, it's worth remembering what I have said." "Do you know what these two look like, these Agak and Gagak?" said Corum. "No. It's possible that they resemble creatures of our own worlds. It's possible they do not. Few have seen them. It is only recently they've been able to materialize at all." "And how may they be best overwhelmed?" said Hawkmoon. "By courage and ingenuity." "You are not very explicit, sir," said Elric. "I am as explicit as I can be. Now, my friends, I suggest you rest and prepare your arms." As they returned to their cabins, Erekosë sighed. "We are fated. We have little free will, for all we deceive ourselves otherwise. If we perish or live through this venture, it will not count for much in the overall scheme of things." "I think you are of a gloomy turn of mind, friend," said Hawkmoon. The mist snaked through the branches of the mast, writhing in the rigging, flooding the deck. It swirled across the faces of the other three men as Elric looked at them. "A realistic turn of mind?" said Corum. The mist massed more thickly upon the deck, mantling each man like a shroud. The timbers of the ship creaked, and to Elric's ears took on the sound of a raven's croak. It was colder now. In silence they went to their cabins to test the hooks and buckles of their armor, to polish and to sharpen their weapons, and to pretend to sleep. "I've no liking for sorcery," said Brute of Lashmar, tugging at his golden beard. "For sorcery it was resulted in my shame." Elric had told him all that the captain had said, and had asked Brute to be one of the 4 who fought with him when they landed. "It is all sorcery here," Otto Blenker said, and he smiled wanly as he gave Elric his hand. "I'll fight beside you, Elric." His sea-green armor shimmering faintly in the lantern light, another rose, his casque pushed back from his face. It was a face almost as white as Elric's, though the eyes were deep and near black. "And I," said Hound Serpent Tamer, "though I fear I am little use on still land." The last to rise at Elric's glance was a warrior who had said little during the earlier conversations. His voice was deep and hesitant. He wore a plain iron battle cap, and the red hair beneath it was braided. At the end of each braid was a small finger bone, which rattled on the shoulders of his byrnie as he moved. This was Ashnar the lynx, whose eyes were rarely less than fierce. "I lack the eloquence of the breeding of you other gentlemen, and I have no familiarity with sorcery or those other things of which you speak, but I'm a good soldier, and my joy is in fighting. I'll take your orders, Elric, if you'll have me." "Willingly," said Elric. "There is no dispute, it seems," said Erekosë to the remaining 4 who had been elected to join him.
All this is doubtless preordained. Our destinies have been linked from the first. Such philosophy can lead to unhealthy fatalism, said Elric of Hasgan. Best believe our fates are our own, even if the evidence denies it. You must think as you wish, said Erekosë. I have led many lives, though all save one are remembered but faintly. Yet I deceive myself, I suppose, in that I work for a time when I shall find this Tanalorn and perhaps be reunited with the one I seek. That ambition is what gives me energy, Elric.
Elric smiled. I fight, I think, because I relish the comradeship of battle. That in itself is a melancholy condition in which to find oneself, is it not?
Aye.
Erekosë glanced at the floor.
Well, we must try to rest now.
Chapter 4 of Pain, Violence, and Loss. The outlines of the coast were dim. They waded through white water and white mist, their swords held above their heads. Swords were their only weapons. Each of the four possessed a blade of unusual size and design, but none bore a sword which occasionally murmured to itself, as did Elric's Stormbringer. Glancing back, Elric saw the captain standing at the rail, his blind face turned towards the island, his pale lips moving as if he spoke to himself. Now the water was waist-deep, and the sand beneath Elric's feet hardened and became smooth rock. He waded on, wary and ready to carry any attack to those who might be defending the island. But now the mist grew thinner, as if it could gain no hold on the land, and there were no obvious signs of defenders. Tucked into his belt, each man had a brand, its end wrapped in oiled cloth so that it should not be wet when the time came to light it. Similarly, each was equipped with a handful of smoldering tinder in a little firebox in a pouch attached to his belt, so the brands could be instantly ignited. "Only fire will destroy this enemy forever," the captain had said, again as he handed them their brands and their tinderboxes. As the mist cleared, it revealed a landscape of dense shadows. The shadows spread over red rock and yellow vegetation, and they were shadows of all shapes and dimensions, resembling all manner of things. They seemed cast by the huge blood-colored sun, which stood at perpetual noon above the island. But what was disturbing about them was that the shadows themselves seemed without a source, as if the objects they represented were invisible, or existed elsewhere than on the island itself. The sky, too, seemed full of these shadows, but whereas those on the island were still, those in the sky sometimes moved, perhaps when the clouds moved. And all the while the red sun poured down its bloody light and touched the 20 men with its unwelcome radiance, just as it touched the land. And at times, as they advanced cautiously inland, a peculiar flickering light crossed the island, so that the outlines of the place became unsteady for a few seconds before returning to focus. Elric suspected his eyes and said nothing, until Hound, serpent tamer, who was having difficulty finding his land legs, remarked, "I have rarely been ashore, it's true, but I think the quality of this land is stranger than any other I've known. It shimmers. It distorts." Several voices agreed with him. "And from whence come all these shadows?" Ashnar the Lynx stared around him in unashamed superstitious awe. "Why cannot we see what casts them?" "It could be," Corum said, "that these shadows are cast by objects existing in other dimensions of the earth. If all dimensions meet here, as has been suggested, that could be a likely explanation." He put his silver hand to his embroidered eye patch. "This is not the strangest example I've witnessed of such a conjunction." "Likely?" Otto Blinker snorted. "Pray, let none give me an unlikely explanation, if you please." They pressed on through the shadows and the lurid light until they arrived at the outskirts of the ruins. These ruins, thought Elric, had something in common with the ramshackle city of Amiron, which he had visited on his quest for the Black Sword, but they were altogether more vast, more a collection of smaller cities, each one in a radically different architectural style. "Perhaps this is Tanalorn," said Corum,
who had visited the place, or rather all the versions of Tanalorn there have ever been, for Tanalorn exists in many forms, each form depending upon the wishes of those who most desire to find her. "This is not the Tanalorn I expected to find," said Hawkmoon bitterly. "Nor I," added Erekosë bleakly. "Perhaps it is not Tanalorn," said Elric. "Perhaps it is not." "Or perhaps this is a graveyard," said Corum distantly, frowning with his single eye. "A graveyard containing all the forgotten versions of that strange city." They began to clamber over the ruins, their arms clattering as they moved, heading for the center of the place. Elric could tell by the introspective expressions in the faces of many of his companions that they, like him, were wondering if this were not a dream. Why else should they find themselves in this peculiar situation, unquestioningly risking their lives, perhaps their souls, in a fight with which none of them was identified? Erekosë moved closer to Elric as they marched. "Have you noticed that the shadows now represent something?" Elric nodded. "You can tell from the ruins what some of the buildings looked like when they were whole. The shadows are the shadows of those buildings, the original buildings before they became ruined." "Just so," said Erekosë. Together, they shuddered. At last they approached the likely center of the place, and here was a building which was not ruined. It stood in a cleared space, all curves and ribbons of metal and glowing tubes. "It resembles a machine more than a building," said Hawkmoon. "And a musical instrument more than a machine," Corum mused. The party came to a halt, each group of 4 gathering about its leader. There was no question they had arrived at their goal. Now that Elric looked carefully at the building, he could see it was in fact 2 buildings, both absolutely identical and joined at various points by curling systems of pipes which might be connecting corridors, although it was difficult to imagine what manner of being could utilize them. "2 buildings," said Erekosë. "We were not prepared for this. Shall we split up and attack both?" Instinctively, Elric felt that this action would be unwise. He shook his head. "I think we should go together into one, else our strength will be weakened." "I agree," said Hawkmoon, and the rest nodded. Thus, there being no cover to speak of, they marched boldly towards the nearest building, to a point near the ground where a black opening of irregular proportions could be discerned. Ominously, there was still no sign of defenders. The buildings pulsed and glowed and occasionally whispered, but that was all. Elric and his party were the first to enter, finding themselves in a damp, warm passage which curved almost immediately to the right. They were followed by the others until all stood in this passage, warily glaring ahead, expecting to be attacked. But no attack came. With Elric at their head, they moved on for some moments before the passage began to tremble violently and sent Hound Serpentamer crashing to the floor, cursing. As the man in the sea-green armor scrambled up, a voice began to echo along the passage, seemingly coming from a great distance, yet nonetheless loud and irritable. Who invades me?" The passage's tremble subsided a little into a constant quivering motion. The voice became a muttering, detached and uncertain. "What attacks? What?" The 20 men glanced at one another in puzzlement. At length Elric shrugged and led the party on, and soon the passage had widened out into a hall whose walls, roof, and floor were damp with sticky fluid, and whose air was hard to breathe. And now, somehow passing themselves through the walls of this hall, came the first of the defenders, ugly beasts who must be the servants of that mysterious brother and sister, Agak and Gagak. "Attack! Destroy this! Destroy it!" The beasts were of a primitive sort, mostly gaping mouth and slithering body, but there were many of them oozing towards the 20 men, who quickly formed themselves into the 4 fighting units and prepared to defend themselves. The creatures made a dreadful slushing sound as they approached, and the ridges of bone which served them as teeth clashed as they reared up to snap at Elric and his companions.
Elric whirled his sword, and it met hardly any resistance as it sliced through several of the things at once. But now the air was thicker than ever, and a stench threatened to overwhelm them as fluid drenched the floor. "Move on through them," Elric instructed, "hacking a path as you go. Head for yonder opening." He pointed with his left hand. And so they advanced, cutting back hundreds of the primitive beasts, and thus decreasing the breathability of the air. "The creatures are not hard to fight," said Hound Serpent Tamer, "but each one we kill robs us a little of our own chances of life." Elric was aware of the irony. Cunningly planned by our enemies, no doubt. He coughed and slashed again at a dozen of the beasts slithering towards him. The things were fearless, but they were stupid too. They made no attempt at strategy. Finally, Elric reached the next passage where the air was slightly purer. He sucked gratefully at the sweeter atmosphere and waved his companions on. Sword arms rising and falling, they gradually retreated back into the passage, followed by only a few of the beasts. The creatures seemed reluctant to enter the passage, and Elric suspected that somewhere within must lie a danger which even they feared. There was nothing for it, however, but to press on, and he was only grateful that all 20 had survived this initial ordeal. Gasping, they rested for a moment, leaning against the trembling walls of the passage, listening to the tones of that distant voice, now muffled and indistinct. "I like not this castle at all," said Brute of Lashmere, inspecting a rent in his cloak where a creature had seized it. "High sorcery commands it." "It is only what we knew," Ashnar the Lynx reminded him, and Ashnar was plainly hard put to control his terror. The finger bones in his braids kept time with the trembling of the walls, and the huge barbarian looked almost pathetic as he steeled himself to go on. "They are cowards, these sorcerers," Otto Blenker said. "They do not show themselves." He raised his voice. "Is their aspect so loathsome they are afraid lest we look upon them?" It was a challenge not taken up. As they pushed on through the passages, there was no sign of either Agak or his sister, Gagak. It became gloomier and brighter in turns. Sometimes the passages narrowed so it was difficult to squeeze their bodies through. Sometimes they widened into what were almost halls. Most of the time they appeared to be climbing higher into the building. Elric tried to guess the nature of the building's inhabitants. There were no steps in the castle, no artifacts he could recognize. For no particular reason he developed an image of Agak and Gagak as reptilian in form, for reptiles would prefer gently rising passages to steps, and doubtless would have little need of conventional furniture. There again, it was possible that they could change their shape at will, assuming human form when it suited them. He was becoming impatient to face either one or both of the sorcerers. Ashnar the Lynx had other reasons, or so he said, for his own lack of patience. "They said there'd be treasure here. I thought to stake my life against a fair reward, but there's naught here of value." He put a horny hand against the damp material of the wall. "Not even stone or brick. What are these walls made of, Elric?" "That has puzzled me also, Ashnar." Then Elric saw large, fierce eyes peering out of the gloom ahead. He heard a rattling noise, a rushing noise, and the eyes grew larger and larger. He saw a red mouth, yellow fangs, orange fur. Then the growling sounded, and the beast sprang at him even as he raised Stormbringer to defend himself and shouted a warning to the others. The creature was a baboon, but huge, and there were at least a dozen others following the first. Elric drove his body forward behind his sword, taking the beast in its groin. Claws reached out and dug into his shoulder and waist. He groaned as he felt at least one set of claws draw blood. His arms were trapped, and he could not pull Stormbringer free. All he could do was twist the sword in the wound he'd already made. With all his might he turned the hilt. The great ape shouted, its bloodshot eyes blazing, and it bared its yellow fangs as its muzzle shot towards Elric's throat. The teeth closed on his neck, the stinking breath threatened to choke him. Again he twisted the blade. Again the beast yelled in pain. The fangs were pressing into the metal of Elric's gorget, the only thing saving him from immediate death. He struggled to free at least one arm, twisting the sword for the third time, then tugging it sideways to widen the wound in the groin. The growls and groans of the baboon grew more intense, and the teeth tightened their hold on his neck, but now, mingled with the noises of the ape, he began to hear a murmuring, and he felt Stormbringer pulse in his hand. He knew the sword was drawing power from the ape, even as the ape sought to destroy him. Some of that power began to flow into his body. Desperately, Elric put all of his remaining strength into dragging the sword across the ape's body, slitting its belly wide so that its blood and entrails spilled over him, and he was suddenly free and staggering backwards, wrenching the sword out in the same movement. The ape, too, was staggering back, staring down in stupefied awe at its own horrible wound before it fell to the floor of the passage. Elric turned, ready to give aid to his nearest comrade, and he was in time to see Elric of Hasgen die, kicking in the clutches of an even larger ape, his head bitten clean from his shoulders, his red blood gouting. Elric drove Stormbringer cleanly between the shoulders of Elric's slayer, taking the ape in the heart. Beast and human victim fell together. 2 others were dead, and several bore bad wounds, but the remaining warriors fought on, swords and armor smeared with crimson. The narrow passage stank of ape, of sweat, and of blood. Elric pressed into the fight, chopping at the skull of an ape which grappled with Hound's serpent tamer who had lost his sword. Hound darted a look of thanks at Elric as he bent to retrieve his blade, and together they set upon the largest of all the baboons. The creature stood much taller than Elric, and had Erekosë pressed against the wall, Erekosë's sword through its shoulder. From 2 sides, Hound and Elric stabbed, and the baboons snarled and screamed, turning to face the new attackers, Erekosë's blade quivering in its shoulder. It rushed upon them, and they stabbed again together, taking the monster in its heart and its lung, so that when it roared at them, blood vomited from its mouth. It fell to its knees, its eyes dimming, and then sank slowly down. And now there was silence in the passage, and death lay all about them. Elric of Hasgen was dead. 2 of Corum's party were also dead. All of Erekosë's surviving men bore major wounds. 1 of Hawkmoon's men was dead, but the remaining 3 were virtually unscathed. Brute of Lashmar's helm was dented, but he was otherwise unwounded, and Ashnar, the lynx, was disheveled, nothing more. Ashnar had taken 2 of the baboons during the fight, but now the barbarian's eyes rolled as he leaned, panting against the wall. "I begin to suspect this venture of being uneconomical," he said, with a half-grin. He rallied himself, stepping over a baboon's corpse to join Elric. "The less time we take over it, the better. What think you, Elric?" "I would agree." Elric returned his grin. "Come," and he led the way through the passage and into a chamber whose walls gave off a pinkish light. He had not walked far when he felt something catch at his ankle, and he stared down in horror to see a long, thin snake winding itself about his leg. It was too late to use his sword. Instead, he seized the reptile behind its head and dragged it partially free of his leg before hacking the head from the body. The others were now stomping and shouting warnings to each other. The snakes did not appear to be venomous, but there were thousands of them, appearing, it seemed, from out of the floor itself. They were flesh-colored and had no eyes, more closely resembling earthworms than ordinary reptiles, but they were strong enough. Hound Serpent Tamer sang a strange song now, with many liquid, hissing notes, and this seemed to have a calming effect upon the creatures. One by one at first, and then in increasing numbers, they dropped back to the floor, apparently sleeping. Hound grinned at his success. Elric said, "Now I understand how you came by your surname. I was not sure the song would work on these, but they're unlike any serpents I have ever seen in the seas of my own world." They waded on through mounds of sleeping serpents, noticing that the next passage rose sharply. At times they were forced to use their hands to steady themselves as they climbed the peculiar slippery material of the floor. It was much hotter in this passage, and they were all sweating, pausing several times to rest and mop their brows. The passage seemed to extend upwards forever, turning occasionally, but never leveling out for more than a few feet. At times it narrowed to little more than a tube through which they had to squirm on their stomachs, and at other times the roof disappeared into the gloom over their heads. Elric had long since given up trying to relate their position to what he'd seen of the castle from the outside. From time to time, small, shapeless creatures rushed towards them in shoals, apparently with the intention of attacking them, but these were rarely more than an irritation, and were soon all but ignored by the party as it continued its climb. For a while they had not heard the strange voice which had greeted them upon their entering, but now it began to whisper again, its tones more urgent than before. Where? Oh, the pain. They paused, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Grim-faced they continued, plagued by thousands of little creatures which bit at their exposed flesh like so many gnats. Yet the creatures were not insects. Elric had seen nothing like them before. They were shapeless, primitive, and all but colorless. They battered at his face as he moved. They were like a wind. Half-blinded, choked, sweating, he felt his strength leaving him. The air was so thick now, so hot, so salty, it was as if he moved through liquid. The others were as badly affected as was he. Some were staggering, and 2 men fell, had to be helped up again by comrades almost as exhausted. Elric was tempted to strip off his armor, but he knew this would leave more of his flesh to the mercy of the little flying creatures. Still they climbed, and now more of the serpentine things they had seen earlier began to writhe around their feet, hampering them further, for all that Hound sang his sleeping song until he was hoarse. "We can survive this only a little longer," said Ashnar the Lynx, moving close to Elric. "We shall be in no condition to meet the sorcerer if we ever find him or his sister." Elric nodded a gloomy head. "My thoughts too. Yet what else may we do, Ashnar?" "Nothing," said Ashnar. "Nothing." Where? The word rustled all about them. Many of the party were becoming openly nervous. Chapter 5. The Meaning of Shadows. They had reached the top of the passage. The querulous voice was much louder now, but it quavered more. They saw an archway, and beyond the archway, a lighted chamber. "Agak's room, without doubt," said Ashnar, taking a better grip on his sword. "Possibly," said Elric. He felt detached from his body. Perhaps it was the heat and the exhaustion or his growing sense of disquiet, but something made him withdraw into himself and hesitate before entering the chamber. The place was octagonal, and each of its 8 sloping sides was of a different color, and each color changed constantly. Occasionally the walls became semi-transparent, revealing a complete view of the ruined city, or collection of cities, far below, and also a view of the twin castle to this one, still connected by tubes and wires. It was the large pool in the center of the chamber which attracted most of their attention. It seemed deep, and was full of evil-smelling, viscous stuff. It bubbled. Shapes formed in it, grotesque and strange, beautiful and familiar. The shapes seemed always on the brink of taking permanent form before falling back into the stuff of the pool. And the voice was still louder, and there was no question now that it came from the pool. What? Who invades?" Elric forced himself closer to the pool and for a moment saw his own face staring out at him before it melted. "Who invades? I am too weak." Elric spoke to the pool. "We are of those you would destroy. We are those on whom you would feed." Agak, I'm sick. Where are you?" Ashnar and Brute joined Elric. The faces of the warriors were filled with disgust. "Agak," growled Ashnar the Lynx, his eyes narrowing. "At last, some sign that the sorcerer is here." The others had all crowded in to stand as far away from the pool as possible, but all stared, fascinated by the variety of shapes forming and disintegrating in the viscous liquid. "I weaken. My energy needs to be replenished. We must begin now. Agak. It took us so long to reach this place. I thought I could rest. But there is disease here. It fills my body. Agak, awaken. Agak, awaken." "Some servant of Agak's charged with the defense of the chamber?" suggested Hound, the serpent tamer. But Elric continued to stare into the pool. As he began, he thought, to realize the truth. "Will Agak awake?" Brute said. "Will he come?" He glanced nervously around him. "Agak!" called Ashnar the Lynx. "Coward!" "Agak!" cried many of the other warriors, brandishing their swords. But Elric said nothing. And he noted, too, that Hawkmoon and Corum and Erekosë all remained silent. He guessed that they must be filled with the same dawning understanding. He looked at them. In Erekosë's eyes he saw an agony, a pity both for himself and his comrades. "We are the four who are one," said Erekosë, his voice shaking. Elric was seized by an alien impulse, an impulse which disgusted and terrified him. No! He attempted to sheathe Stormbringer, but the sword refused to enter its scabbard.
"Agak, quickly,"
said the voice from the pool.
"If we do not do this thing," said Erekosë, "they will eat all our worlds. Nothing will remain."
Elric put his free hand to his head. He swayed on the edge of that frightful pool. He moaned. "We must do it, then." Corum's voice was an echo. "I will not," said Elric. "I am myself."
"And I,"
said Hawkmoon. But Corum said, "It is the only way for us, for the single thing that we are. Do you not see that? We are the only creatures of our worlds who possess the means of slaying the sorcerers, in the only manner in which they can be slain." Elric looked at Corum, at Hawkmoon, at Erekosë, and again he saw something of himself in all of them. "We are the four who are one," said Erekosë. "Our united strength is greater than the sum. We must come together, brothers. We must conquer here before we can hope to conquer Agak." No. Elric moved away, but somehow he found himself standing at a corner of the bubbling, noxious pool from which the voice still murmured and complained, in which shapes still formed, reformed, and faded, and at each of the other three corners stood one of his companions. All had a set, fatalistic look to them. The warriors who had accompanied the four drew back to the walls. Otto Blenker and Brood of Lashmar stood near the doorway, listening for anything which might come up the passage to the chamber. Ashnar the Lynx fingered the brand at his belt, a look of pure horror on his rugged features. Elric felt his arm begin to rise, drawn upward by his sword, and he saw that each of his three companions were also lifting their swords. The swords reached out across the pool, and their tips met above the exact center. Elric yelled as something entered his being. Again he tried to break free, but the power was too strong. Other voices spoke in his head. "I understand." This was Corum's distant murmur. "It is the only way." "Oh, no! No!" And this was Hawkmoon, but the words came from Elric's lips. "Agak!" cried the pool. The stuff became more agitated, more alarmed. "Agak! Quickly! Wake!" Elric's body began to shake, but his hand kept a firm hold upon the sword. The atoms of his body flew apart, and then united again into a single flowing entity which traveled up the blade of the sword towards the apex. And Elric was still Elric, shouting with the terror of it, sighing with the ecstasy of it. Elric was still Elric when he drew away from the pool and looked upon himself for a single moment, seeing himself wholly joined with his three other selves. A being hovered over the pool. On each side of its head was a face, and each face belonged to one of the companions. Serene and terrible, the eyes did not blink. It had 8 arms, and the arms were still. It squatted over the pool on 8 legs, and its armor and accoutrement were of all the colors blending, and at the same time separate. The being clutched a single great sword in all 8 hands, and both he and the sword glowed with a ghastly golden light. Then Elric had rejoined this body, and had become a different thing. Himself and 3 others, and something else, which was the sum of that union. The 4 who were one reversed its monstrous sword, so the point was directed downward at the frenetically boiling stuff in the pool below. The stuff feared the sword. It mewled, "Agak! Agak!" The being of whom Elric was a part gathered its great strength and began to plunge the sword down. Shapeless waves appeared on the surface of the pool. Its whole color changed from sickly yellow to an unhealthy green. "Agak, I die!" Inexorably, the sword moved down. It touched the surface. The pool swept back and forth. It tried to ooze over the sides and onto the floor. The sword bit deeper, and the four who were one felt new strength flow up the blade. Then came a moan. Slowly the pool quieted. It became silent. It became still. It became gray. Then the four who were one descended into the pool to be absorbed. It could see clearly now. It tested its body. It controlled every limb, every function. It had triumphed. It had revitalized the pool. Through its single octagonal eye, it looked in all directions at the same time over the wide ruins of the city. Then it focused all its attention upon its twin. Agak had awakened too late, but he was awakening at last, roused by the dying cries of his sister Gagak, whose body the mortals had first invaded, and whose intelligence they had overwhelmed, whose eye they now used, and whose powers they would soon attempt to utilize. Agak did not need to turn his head to look upon the being he still saw as his sister. Like hers, his intelligence was contained within the huge eight-sided eye. "Did you call me, sister?" "I spoke your name. That is all, brother." There were enough vestiges of Gagak's life force in the four who were one for it to imitate her manner of speaking. "You cried out?" "A dream." The four paused, and then it spoke again. "A disease. I dreamed that there was something upon this island which made me unwell." "Is that possible? We do not know sufficient about these dimensions or the creatures inhabiting them, yet none is as powerful as Agak. And Gagak, fear not, sister. We must begin our work soon." "It is nothing. Now I am awake." Agak was puzzled. "You speak oddly." "The dream," answered the creature which had entered Gagak's body and destroyed her. "We must begin," said Agak. "The dimensions turn and the time has come. Ah, feel it. It waits for us to take it so much rich energy. How we shall conquer when we go home." "I feel it," replied the four, and it did. It felt its whole universe, dimension upon dimension, swirling about it, stars and planets and moons through plane upon plane, all full of the energy upon which Agak and Gagak had desired to feed. And there was enough of Gagak still within the four to make the four experience a deep, anticipatory hunger which, now that the dimensions attained the right conjunction, would soon be satisfied. The four was tempted to join with Agak and feast, although it knew if it did so, it would rob its own universe of every shred of energy. Stars would fade, worlds would die. Even the Lords of Law and Chaos would perish, for they were part of the same universe. Yet, to possess such power, it might be worth committing such a tremendous crime. It controlled this desire, and gathered itself for its attack before Agak became too wary. "Shall we feast, sister?" The four realized that the ship had brought it to the island at exactly the proper moment. Indeed, they had almost come too late. "Sister?" Agak was again puzzled. "What?" The four knew it must disconnect from Agak. The tubes and wires fell away from his body and were withdrawn into Gagak's. "What's this?" Agak's strange body trembled for a moment. "Sister?" The four prepared itself. For all that it had absorbed Gagak's memories and instincts, it was still not sufficient that it would be able to attack Agak in her chosen form. And since the sorceress had possessed the power to change her form, the four began to change, groaning greatly, experiencing dreadful pain, drawing all the materials of its stolen being together, so that what had appeared to be a building now became a pulpy, unformed flesh. And Agak, stunned, looked on. "Sister," Your sanity! The building, the creature that was Gagak, threshed, melted, and erupted. It screamed in agony. It attained its form. It laughed. 4 faces laughed upon a gigantic head. 8 arms waved in triumph. 8 legs began to move. And over that head, it waved a single, massive sword, and it was running. It ran upon Agak while the alien sorcerer was still in his static form. Its sword was whirling, and shards of ghastly golden light fell away from it as it moved, lashing the shadowed landscape. The 4 was as large as Agak, and at this moment it was as strong. But Agak, realizing his danger, began to suck. No longer would this be a pleasurable ritual shared with his sister. He must suck at the energy of this universe if he were to find the strength to defend himself, to gain what he needed to destroy his attacker, the slayer of his sister. Worlds died as Agak sucked, but not enough. Agak tried cunning. This is the center of your universe. All its dimensions intersect here. Come, you can share the power. My sister is dead. I accept her death. You shall be my partner now. With this power, we shall conquer a universe far richer than this. No, said the 4, still advancing. Very well, but be assured of your defeat. The 4 swung its sword. The sword fell upon the faceted eye within which Agak's intelligence pool bubbled, just as his sister's had once bubbled, but Agak was stronger already and healed himself at once. Agak's tendrils emerged and lashed at the 4, and the 4 cut at the tendrils as it sought his body, and Agak sucked more energy to himself. His body, which the mortals had mistaken for a building, began to glow burning scarlet and to radiate an impossible heat. The sword roared and flared so that black light mingled with the gold and flowed against the scarlet, and all the while the 4 could sense its own universe shrinking and dying. Give back, Agak, what you have stolen, said the 4. Planes and angles and curves, wires and tubes flickered with deep red heat, and Agak sighed. The universe whimpered. I am stronger than you. Now. And Agak sucked again. The 4 knew that Agak's attention was diverted for just that short while as he fed, and the 4 knew that it too must draw energy from its own universe if Agak were to be defeated, so the sword was raised. The sword was flung back, its blade slicing through tens of thousands of dimensions and drawing their power to it. Then it began to swing back. It swung and black light bellowed from its blade. It swung, and Agak became aware of it. His body began to alter down toward the sorcerer's great eye. Down towards Agak's intelligence pool swept the black blade. Agak's many tendrils rose to defend the sorcerer against the sword, but the sword cut through them as if they were not there, and it struck the 8-sided chamber which was Agak's eyes, and it plunged on down into Agak's intelligence pool, deep into the stuff of the sorcerer's sensibility, drawing up Agak's energy into itself, and thence into its master, the 4 who were one. And something screamed through the universe, and something sent a tremor through the universe, and the universe was dead, even as Agak began to die. The 4 did not dare wait to see if Agak were completely vanquished. It swept the sword out, back through the dimensions, and everywhere the blade touched, the energy was restored. The sword rang round and round, dispersing the energy, and the sword sang its triumph and its glee. And little shreds of black and golden light whispered away, and were reabsorbed. For a moment, the universe had been dead. Now it lived, and Agak's energy had been added to it. Agak lived too, but he was frozen. He had attempted to change his shape. Now he still half resembled the building Elric had seen when he first came to the island, but part of him resembled the 4 who were one. Here was a part of Corum's face, here a leg, there a fragment of sword blade, as if Agak had believed, at the end, that the 4 could only be defeated if its own form were assumed, just as the 4 had assumed Gagak's form. We had waited so long." Agag sighed, and then he was dead. And the four sheathed its sword. Then there came a howling through the ruins of the many cities, and a strong wind blustered against the body of the four, so it was forced to kneel on its 8 legs and bow its 4-faced head before the gale. Then, gradually, it reassumed the shape of Gagak the sorceress, and then it lay within Gagak's stagnating intelligence pool, and then it rose over it, hovered for a moment, withdrew its sword from the pool. The 4 beings fled apart, and Elric and Hawkmoon and Erekosë and Corum stood with sword blades touching over the center of the dead brain. The 4 men sheathed their swords. They stared for a second into each other's eyes, and all saw terror and awe there. Elric turned away. He could find neither thoughts nor emotions in him which would relate to what had happened. There were no words he could use. He stood looking dumbly at Ashnar the Lynx, and he wondered why Ashnar giggled and chewed at his beard and scraped at the flesh of his own face with his fingernails, his sword forgotten upon the floor of the great chamber. "Now I have flesh again! Now I have flesh!" Ashnar kept saying. Elric wondered why Hound Serpent Tamer lay curled in a ball at Ashnar's feet, and why when Brute of Lashmar emerged from the passage he fell down and lay stretched upon the floor, stirring a little and moaning, as if in a disturbed slumber. Otto Blenker came into the chamber. His sword was in its scabbard. His eyes were shut tight, and he hugged himself, shivering. Elric thought to himself, "I must forget all this, or sanity will disappear forever." He went to Brute and helped the blonde warrior to his feet. "What did you see?" "More than I deserve for all my sins. We were trapped in that skull." And then Brute began to weep as a small child might weep, and Elric took the tall warrior in his own arms and stroked his head, and could not find words or sounds with which to comfort him. "We must go," said Erekosë. His eyes were glazed. He staggered as he walked. Thus, dragging those who had fainted, leading those who had gone mad, leaving those who had died behind, they fled through the dead passages of Gagak's body, no longer plagued by the things she had created in her attempt to rid that body of those she had experienced as an invading disease. The passages and chambers were cold and brittle, and the men were glad when they stood outside and saw the ruins, the sourceless shadows, the red static sun. Otto Blenker was the only one of the warriors who seemed to retain his sanity through the ordeal, when they'd been absorbed unknowingly into the body of the 4 who were one. He dragged his brand from his belt, took out his tinder and ignited it. Soon the brand was flaming, and the others lighted theirs from his. Elric trudged to where Agag's remains still lay, and shuddered as he recognized in a monstrous stone face part of his own features. He felt that the stuff could not possibly burn, but it did. Behind him Gagak's body blazed too. They were swiftly consumed, and pillars of growling fire jutted up into the sky, sending up a smoke of white and crimson, which for a little while obscured the red disk of the sun. The men watched the corpses burn. "I wonder," said Corum, "if the captain knew why he sent us here. Or if he suspected what would happen," said Hawkmoon. Hawkmoon's tone was near to resentful. Only that being could battle Agag and Gagak in anything resembling their own terms," said Erekosë. "Other means would not have been successful. No other creature could have had the particular qualities, the enormous power needed to slay such strange sorcerers." "So it seems," said Elric, and he would talk no more of it. "Hopefully," said Corum, "you will forget this experience as you forgot, or will forget, the other." Elric offered him a hard stare. "Hopefully, brother," he said. Erekosë's chuckle was ironic. Who could recall that? And he, too, said no more. Ashnar the lynx, who had ceased his gigglings as he watched the fire, shrieked suddenly and broke away from the main party. He ran towards the flickering column and then veered away, disappearing among the ruins in the shadows. Otto Blenker gave Elric a questioning stare, but Elric shook his head. Why follow? What can we do for it? He looked down at Hound, serpent tamer. He had particularly liked the man in the sea-green armor. He shrugged. When they moved on, they left the curled body of Hound, serpent tamer where it lay, helping only Brute of Lashmar across the rubble and down to the shore. Soon they saw the white mist ahead and knew they neared the sea, though the ship was not in sight. At the edge of the mist, both Hawkmoon and Erekosë paused. I will not rejoin the ship, said Hawkmoon. I feel I've served my passage now. If I can find Tanalorn, this, I suspect, is where I must look. My own feelings, Erekosë nodded his head. Elric looked at Corum. Corum smiled. I have already found Tanalorn. I go back to the ship in the hope that soon it will deposit me on a more familiar shore. That is my hope, said Elric. His arm still supported Brute of Lashmar. Brute whispered, What was it? What happened to us? Elric increased his grip upon the warrior's shoulder. Nothing, he said. Then, as Elric tried to lead Brute back into the mist, the blond warrior stepped back, breaking free. I will stay, he said. He moved away from Elric. I'm sorry. Elric was puzzled. Brute? I am sorry. I fear you. I fear that ship. Elric made to follow the warrior, but Corum put a hard silver hand upon his shoulder. Comrade, let us be gone from this place. His smile was bleak. It is what is back there I fear more than the ship. They stared over the ruins. In the distance they could see the remains of the fire, and there were two shadows there now, the shadows of Gagak and Agak, as they had first appeared to them. Elric drew a cold breath of air. With that, I agree, he told Corum. Otto Blenker was the only warrior who chose to return to the ship with them. If that is Tanalorn, it is not, after all, the place I sought, he said. Soon they were waist deep in the water. They saw again the outlines of the dark ship. They saw the captain leaning on the rail, his arm raised as if in salute to someone or something upon the island. Captain, called Corum, we come aboard. You are welcome, said the captain. Yes, you are welcome. The blind face turned towards them as Elric reached out for the rope ladder. Would you care to sail for a while into the silent places, the restful places? I think so, said Elric. He paused halfway up the ladder and touched his head. I have many wounds. He reached the rail, and with his own cool hands the captain helped him over. They will heal, Elric. Elric moved closer to the mast. He leaned against it and watched the silent crew as they unfurled the sail. Corum and Otto Blenker came aboard. Elric listened to the sharp sound of the anchor as it was drawn up. The ship swayed a little. Otto Blenker looked at Elric, then at the captain, and then he turned and went into his cabin, saying nothing at all as he closed the door. The sail filled, the ship began to move. The captain reached out and found Elric's arm. He took Corum's arm, too, and led them towards his cabin. The wine, it will heal all the wounds. At the door of the captain's cabin, Elric paused. And does the wine have other properties? Does it cloud a man's reason? Was it that which made me accept your commission, Captain? The captain shrugged. What is reason? The ship was gathering speed. The white mist was thicker and a cold wind blew at the rags of cloth and metal Elric wore. He sniffed, thinking for a moment that he smelled smoke upon that wind. He put his 2 hands to his face and touched his flesh. His face was cold. He let his hands fall to his sides, and he followed the captain into the warmth of the cabin. The captain poured wine into silver cups from his silver jug. He stretched out a hand to offer a cup to Elric and to Corum. They drank. A little later, the captain said, "How do you feel?" Elric said, "I feel nothing." And that night, he dreamed only of shadows, and in the morning, he could not understand his dream at all.